And
Right,
we're looking for
right.
the
I mean,
demand.
this is, as I would hold, it's a religious dogma in our country right now. You know, sitting at the table, what does it mean to be an American, especially when you have people that migrate here and are trying to become citizens and then become citizens? What does it mean to be an American? And one of the things I found my friends at least all agreed with was basically to say that all men are created equal, and endowed with certain rights. I didn't say, from the Creator, because not everyone would agree with that, but that you have certain rights, and those rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We say that, right? And if you believe it, that gets to make you an American, basically, right? So becoming an American is not a birthright only. It could, you certainly, I was born an American citizen, never had to take an oath prior to my being officially a citizen. I haven't had to take the test that my immigrants, applying for citizenship have had to take. Be interesting. I think I've seen a lot of the questions, but be interesting. I think a lot of the questions are hard. You have to study. Pardon?
Pretty sure I couldn't pass it.
Oh, you could study. You
that
just
test.
study it. Yeah, study for it, I suppose. But so it's different than by blood in Europe, as I understand it. If not all European countries, you earn citizenship by blood. So you have to be born not just in the country, but to citizens of the country. For example, Turkish children born of Turkish parents in Germany are not Turks according to Turkey, but neither are they Germans according to Germany, and so as a result, they're stateless. And that's a continuing problem for a lot of what do you even call them? Foreigners that have been born in Germany and lived there all their life. So there's a difference. I forget how it's expressed, but if it's by blood, that's certain countries in Europe, but in the United States, it's not by blood. Although, like John McCain was born outside of the country to American parents, so he was born a citizen. He was born abroad, but he's an American citizen. So that's interesting, because that's obviously by blood, if you think of it that way.
Is it on a military base, so it's still U.S. soil?
I think so.
Yeah. My father was born in France.
Yeah, my daughter Kat was born in Berlin, Germany. American GI had her, and then we adopted her and brought her back. But we have a certificate that says she was born an American citizen in Berlin. So
That's how my brother was, because he was born, my dad was stationed in Munich, Germany, when they had him.
mhm.
So technically, they said that he's born on American soil, even though he was born in Germany. Kind of
But
confusing.
aliens, especially illegal aliens, have no rights. Although it could, of course, be confusing if you think of the UN Declaration of Universal Rights,
Right.
which we are signatories to. But strictly speaking, someone who's not an American citizen and caught in this country illegally does not have the rights of citizens. That seems pretty obvious, but I think there are certain rights that are granted to them anyway, although, of course, that's a big fight right now with all of that stuff. Can they be forced to separate from their children, for example? Wow, all those issues. But I would say that by saying that we're created equal, what we mean is we all have the same legal rights, at least as citizens, right? So if you're talking about citizens, you all have the same legal rights. But that's still confusing, because if you're a child, a minor, you might be a citizen, but you're not allowed to vote. You're not allowed to do other things depending on the state you're in and the age at which they allow you to do certain things. Like I remember it being kind of amazing that a lot of people could join the military at 18, but you couldn't drink until you were 21. Even in Alaska, the paper just this morning was talking about the young man who was out drinking with two friends on the beach in Dutch Harbor. And the reason they were drinking out on the beach was because they were too young to be drinking in the bar, because they were 18, I guess. And so they were out getting drunk on the beach, and one of them ended up drowning. That was in the paper, right, just this morning. So, they didn't have the same rights as they would have if they were just 3 years older. So that's, so how do you reconcile all men are created equal? That's hard. It's hard to do that. And it's obviously evolving. So the whole situation is essentially evolving, and it's changed because different people have the right to citizenship now. We don't have no one has the legal right to own someone else, for example. I can't, decide, okay, I've bought these two Irishmen to work on my farm. Can't bring Irishmen from Ireland, and just decide, okay, they're, my indentured servants, and so, I've got a contract. No, that would not fly in any state I know of currently, although that's how a lot of Irishmen actually ended up in the United States. So what I want to get to, of course, is the problem when you look at Hegel's philosophy, which is an organic, evolving view of the nature of everything, including truth. Right? Statements that were true in 1860 are no longer true today. So what's true and false has evolved and is continuing to evolve. How does that make you feel, knowing that what's true, it might be true, you might say something is true today?
Like, what's an example?
Well, one example would be that slavery is legal. Well, it isn't today. That's false today in this country, right? But in 1860, it would have been true that slavery was legal. Was it legal in all the states? You could bring your slaves from a state that allowed state ownership into another state and bring them back, right? Because they were your property, coming and going, right? So that would be an example of a statement that was true in 1860 but false today. Women have no right to property. That's false today, but it was true up until when were women given property rights?
Late 1800s?
Allowed to vote, was it the same?
Suffrage and property rights?
1919? I think it was. I think it was the same amendment that allowed women to vote, that also gave them the right to property. not sure, but I mean, up to that, up to the point where they were legally allowed to own property when a parent died and the children inherited the property of the parent, the girls could not inherit. It was only the males. And usually, the big problem, of course, in England was that it was only the oldest male. All the other kids were totally dependent on the oldest one, giving them the wealth that they needed in order to survive.
1839,
So they did have the right to property in 1839?
Mississippi allows them to own property in their own name. In 1844, Maine. I think it started to gradually permeate through the states as local communities started to petition for it and assemblies and voting started. I remember reading something I thought in Dakotas, Minnesota, somewhere in the late 1800s started allowing for it, but here, I didn't realize it was 1839.
I know if you've had to suffer through the Jane Austen books, that was like one of the main issues. Of course, all the young women knew that they had no hope to inherit wealth or live their own lives unless they got some goofy male interested enough in them to marry them so that they could.
That's right. Married Women's Property Act of 1848.
So the issue that I'm trying to get to though is truth evolves. How does that make you feel? I mean, aren't we supposed to think that what's true is true for Immel, right? You know, always. Nobody's excited. Nobody's worried about that. Well, Dewey attempted to deal with that by using the expression warranted assertions. So instead of saying that something is true, he argued, and the problem is psychological. When we say that something is true, finding out 10 years later that you were wrong is psychologically hard to take. And you might not even want to believe it just because, well, wait a minute, I'm committed to this being true, right? For one thing, especially if you're being interviewed in a committee on what phone call you listen to, to say 1 week, that there was no quid pro quo, and the next week that there was a quid pro quo. I listened to the same conversation. Now I remember that I did, that I didn't remember the last time. That's psychologically difficult to do. And so he argues, instead of saying that we should refer to statements as being true, we should instead say that they are warranted assertions based on the data, the experiments that we have so far. This statement is a warranted assertion. And that opens the psychological possibility that once you have more data or more experiments, that's open to changing the statement as you find out more, right? So that's his way of handling like scientific developments, right? We refer to them as this hypothesis. And he also talks about the theory of inquiry. These are like all books that he writes. If you look him up, let's see if I can find his list of books, publications.
introduce anything on the bilateral communication between the hemispheres of the corpus callosum, and like how the left side of the brain operates versus the right side of the brain as far as interpreting truth?
What do you mean, do I introduce it?
Does it come up with these guys at all, or some of the more modern philosophers? Because it seems like the warranted assertion points out the fact that the only absolute truth is that nothing is truly absolute. There is nothing that is absolutely true.
Well, the way the pragmatists take this, Albert Einstein gets his own bit regarding epistemology and relativity, because of course, theory of relativity, it sounds like, well, everything is relative, so there's no truth. Well, that's false. Well, instead we have our different complex systems, like math, 1 + 1 = 2. And those are based on axioms, and you have to accept those axioms to do math. Right? But then you have different types of geometry, and so Euclid's 5th proposition, no two parallel lines ever meet, right? Well, that's wrong when you're talking about hyperbolic geometry where they actually converge, right? So some mathematicians will say that means that Sir Isaac Newton and Euclid were wrong, and they've been supplanted. I think that's wrong to say it that way. Instead, what we have are different systems, and you just have to identify which system you're using and follow the rules in that system. And in Euclid's system, it's true that parallel lines will never cross in that Euclidean geometry, right? But in hyperbolic geometry, they do, right? That doesn't mean that one is false and the other is true. They're both useful in different contexts.
Right, the utility of the statement of
Right.
the warranted assertion is like you can't step into the same river twice. That knowledge isn't necessarily functional, because there's still going to be a river there most of the time, and it's going to be passable or impassable at certain times of the year. So regardless of whether it's the same exact river, isn't the functional piece of information, isn't the truth. The pattern, the probability is what's useful, and the probability is just that. It's not an absolute. It's not absolutely true,
Mm-hmm.
but the probability is the utility statement in that, worthy of assertion. Right?
But, so it does get complex, because you have to figure out, well, which system or which pattern would be the most useful in this particular, for this goal, right? What is our goal? It depends, right? Even with regard to something incredibly complex, like trying to decide whether the president broke a law, and should be impeached or not, right? Watching all of that take place, I haven't watched it that closely because it's, you just have to watch a little of it, and you feel like you've got the whole gist of what's going on, right? You've got two different groups that have different values. One group that, of course, are for the president and the things he's doing, the other group that wants him out, whichever way they can do. They're both interpreting, the situation, and it's easy to see that both of them are right. And when you look at it that way, you could listen to Rachel Maddow on the one channel and then go one channel over, and you get a completely different point of view, and you can say, okay, well, how do we explain what's going on here? We've got two different systems, two different language groups, two sets of values. They're coherent within themselves, as coherent as anything of that complexity could be, right? So they're coherent in themselves, and of course it's this democracy that's moving forward in a way. It's absolutely invigorating and thrilling to see our country going through this, because it just shows how incredibly dynamic and powerful our system is, that we can have these kinds of inner conflicts that are just, where are they leading? You know, what's this going to lead to? You know, the whole world watches it, and you know, they're jealous. They're jealous because they're trying to imitate it. Prime Minister Modi, you know, is trying to imitate Donald Trump. You know, I think Erdogan in Turkey is trying to imitate. You know, Putin is kind of in his own bailiwick, I suppose. But I mean, a lot of people are saying Donald Trump is imitating Putin, right? You know, so you know, you might think this is horrible, but look at it from another perspective. The world is just watching this in amazement, because this is their future. They're seeing their future in what's transpiring here, and the dynamism in our politics. It's just absolutely amazing what we do to one another, you know, in all of this, and where it goes. You know, that's kind of amazing. But pragmatism, I think, gives us the tool to understand what's going on by looking at it this way. It's not like, oh, they're right. Why don't these people just give up and realize that they're wrong? Well, that's not going to happen, because, of course, we can understand French people still speak French after all these years. They haven't wised up and learned to speak English.
You don't think
Fact
so
that-
if you don't
because
speak French.
Yeah, they don't think you're intelligent if you don't speak French. How wrong can they be? You know? I'm joking. You realize, yeah. I mean, how long is that going to be? You know, eventually, there's going to be some other language altogether, I suppose.
One drop of water at a time.
Well, I mean, you know, new words pop up all the time. And who knows where they come from? In fact, the main language worldwide right now is not English.
Mandarin?
Well, if you look at the majority of speakers of any language, it's definitely either Mandarin or
Spanish.
Yeah, probably Spanish.
Spanish is very popular too. But what's the Hindu? What's the language in India? Bengali, but not Bengali is not the
Hindi?
main.
Hindi?
Hindi?
Farsi, Urdu?
That's Iran and
Probably Hindi.
Pakistan.
I think it's Hindi,
Hindi, yeah.
because my roommate's Indian.
Yeah, because it's China, then India.
Yeah, it's Hindi.
It's Hindi.
Official languages of India is Hindi and English.
But actually, as far as I know, the main language for business today is not any of those, but instead is English. Did I say that right?